Leave it, Keane. You're here to hand out bandages, not play soldier. The words cut sharper than the desert wind. But Nora Keane didn't flinch. She'd heard it before. The smirks, the sideways looks, the unspoken rule that medics stayed behind the trigger line. Not today. Protocol said stand down. But on Falcon Spire's wind-scoured ridge, Nora Keane ignored every rule. Blood pooled beside the wounded sniper. The Brimstone 50 lay in the dust, still warm from enemy fire. In the ravine below, fighters moved into position, seconds from cutting down the convoy. One breath, one squeeze of the trigger, and in that instant, the medic no one trusted became the only thing standing between her team and annihilation. At Fort Ashara, in the middle of a wind-scoured desert, Specialist Nora Keane was easy to overlook. She wasn't the kind of soldier who barked orders or carried the heaviest weapon. Her duties kept her in the medical bay, tending to sprained ankles, heat exhaustion, and the occasional gunshot wound. Most of the base knew her simply as the medic, the quiet one, the one you passed without remembering later. They didn't know the truth, that before the uniform with the Red Cross patch, before the steady hands stitching wounds under pressure, she had been something else. She had been a student of Eamon Keane, her late brother, a sniper whose reputation was whispered in training circles and war stories. He had been a master of patience and precision, the kind of man who could wait 20 hours for a single clean shot. And he had trained exactly one person, his kid sister. Eamon was gone now, lost on an off-book mission that left more questions than answers. Nora had buried the rifles, the charts, the years of muscle memory, or so she told herself. It was late afternoon when the words cut into her routine like a blade. Leave it, Keane. You're here to hand out bandages, not play soldier. The sergeant didn't mean it cruelly. To him, it was just a fact. But the smirks from the others nearby, those sideways looks, stung more than she let on. The unspoken rule was clear. Medics stayed behind the trigger line. They patched the broken. They didn't stop the breaking. Nora didn't flinch. She'd heard it before. But something in her tightened. The desert wind that night carried a chill that didn't belong in summer. Nora was in her quarters, cataloging supplies, when the old spectral link terminal on her desk flickered to life. It was a salvaged piece of tech, something she had rebuilt from drone scrap, more a personal project than official equipment. The screen blinked once, then twice. A message appeared in block text. Obsidian 9, Overwatch vulnerability detected. Tomorrow's route is compromised. Null Wind Ravine exposed. Nora's heart slowed. She hadn't seen the name Null Wind Ravine in months. Not since she'd been studying topographic maps for casualty evacuation routes. She knew its shape, its shadowed choke points, the way it could hide an entire enemy squad. She checked the mission roster. The next morning, a convoy would move east, right past that ravine. The message wasn't addressed to her. It wasn't addressed to anyone. But she knew enough to recognize that someone out there was warning her, specifically her. She stared at the screen, hearing her brother's voice as clearly as if he stood beside her. Precision is what remains when chaos takes everything else. She tried to follow procedure. The next morning, she approached Commander Reese Calder, maps in hand. Sir, I believe Null Wind is a covered line of approach, she said, keeping her voice steady. If the enemy's dug in there, Calder didn't even look up. Your role is medical support, Keane. I don't need terrain analysis from a field medic. Dismissed. Her warning died in the air between them. Back in her quarters, the spectral link pulsed again. Obsidian 9. You're the only one who sees it. Act if they won't. This time the words hit harder. They weren't just a warning. They were a challenge. An accusation. Nora sat very still, the hum of the desert outside mixing with the rush of her own pulse. She thought of Kandahar years ago, waiting for clearance while a Marine bled out in front of her. She thought of the smirks, the way people dismissed her, and she thought, not today. Somewhere far from the sterile lights of the medical bay, trouble was waiting in Null Wind Ravine. And whether or not she had permission, she already knew she wasn't going to sit this one out. The sun hadn't fully risen when Nora strode toward the command tent, her boots crunching against the gravel like a metronome to her own thoughts. The base was waking. Voices on the morning comms check, the metallic clang of weapons racks opening, but none of it registered. In her hands was a folded map, edges worn from too many late-night studies. On it, she had marked the one thing no one else seemed willing to see, the null wind ravine. Commander Reese Calder was hunched over the operations table, the kind of man who carried authority in the set of his jaw more than the volume of his voice. His attention was fixed on a series of convoy route overlays, clean and predictable lines across the desert. Nora stopped 2 paces from the table. "Sir, I believe null wind is a covered line of approach. If hostiles are set there, the convoy could be walking into a kill zone." Calder didn't look up. His pen tapped once against the map. "Your role is medical support, Specialist Keane. I don't need terrain analysis from a field medic." She tried again, forcing calm into her tone. "With respect, sir, this isn't theory. That ridge offers perfect elevation for an ambush. The enemy wouldn't even need heavy weapons." "Dismissed," he said, sharper this time. Not angry, just final. It was the kind of moment that happens quietly but leaves an echo. In military culture, the chain of command is both lifeline and blindfold. Orders keep a unit alive in chaos, but that same rigidity can turn lethal when information from the bottom never climbs to the top. Nora knew this wasn't just a possibility. History had proven it. She remembered reading about the 2009 Battle of Wanat in Afghanistan, a small U.S. outpost overrun because repeated warnings about enemy buildup were ignored. Or the Pearl Harbor intelligence cables in 1941 that were lost in bureaucratic delay. Even in civilian life, tragedies like the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster had roots in the same cause. People saw the danger, but decision-makers wouldn't hear it. It was always the same pattern. The warning comes, the authority dismisses it, and the cost is paid in lives. Back in her quarters, Nora stared at the folded map on her desk. The paper felt heavier than it should, like it carried more than just ink. She sat down hard in the metal chair, forcing herself to slow her breathing. That's when the spectral link pulsed again. The same flicker, the same green text on a black background. Obsidian 9. You're the only one who sees it. Act if they won't. Her throat tightened. This wasn't just an analysis from some shadow analyst. It was a direct call to her. And it wasn't framed as a suggestion. It was an imperative. She leaned back, eyes fixed on the message. Every instinct screamed that whoever was sending these transmissions had eyes on the enemy. Maybe drones, maybe recon teams, and was bypassing the official chain to reach her. The reason was obvious. They knew Calder wouldn't act. Her mind wasn't in the present anymore. It had gone back to Kandahar, to a winter night years ago. She could still smell the cordite and blood. A Marine had been brought in, a gunshot wound high in the thigh, arterial bleeding. She had been ready to clamp, pack, and transfuse. But the order hadn't come down yet. The casualty was still unsecured, and the protocol said she had to wait until the firefight was clear before beginning intervention. She waited. The Marine bled out in 8 minutes. Later, the debrief called it unavoidable given the tactical situation. But she knew better. It hadn't been unavoidable. It had been a decision to let process override urgency. That night, she made herself a silent promise. Never again. She read the message again, each word sinking deeper. You're the only one who sees it. Act if they won't. It was both an accusation and a dare. Her eyes moved to the corner of the desk, where a small, battered photo of Eamon Keane sat in a frame scratched by years of field carry. She could almost hear his voice, calm, steady, like the moments before a shot. You don't wait for permission to prevent a mistake. You prevent it, or you own it. Outside, the base moved with its usual rhythm. Vehicles fueled up, rifles were cleaned, men and women joked between tasks. All of it under the assumption that the road ahead was safe. Nora knew better. The fight in her chest wasn't just about defying orders. It was about the weight of choice. If she stayed in her lane, she could keep her record clean. No disciplinary action, no breach of trust. But if the convoy rolled into that ravine and didn't roll back out, she'd have to live knowing she could have changed it. And that, she realized, was a sentence she couldn't serve. The mission rolled out under a sky the color of bleached steel. The heat had not yet peaked, but the air already carried that restless desert shimmer. Engines hummed in the convoy line as dust began to rise. marking their path like a trail of smoke across the plain. Up ahead, the Overwatch team moved first. Sergeant Cal Mercer and his spotter, Liam Rourke. They were the kind of pair that made you feel safer just knowing they were on the ridge. Cal with his unshakable patience behind the Brimstone point confident, Liam with his razor-sharp glassing skills. Together, they were the shield over the convoy's head. From Fort Ashara's operations tent, their ascent was just a moving blip on the route tracker. From Nora's position at the medical prep station, it was a countdown she couldn't ignore. Cal's voice crackled over comms, calm as ever. Overwatch in position, clear skies, visibility optimal. The report was textbook. No one in the tent flinched. Calder gave a curt nod and returned to scanning the convoy line on the map. And then the sky cracked. It wasn't the echo of small arms. It was deeper, heavier. A mortar shell slammed into the ridge just behind Cal and Liam's position, the blast echoing through the desert like a hammer blow to the earth. Shards of rock and dirt exploded upward, blotting out the sun for a moment. From the med station, Nora froze mid-step. Her headset erupted in chaos. Ghost is down! Ghost is hit! Brimstone lost! It was Liam's voice, jagged with panic. He almost never raised his voice on comms. That alone told Nora how bad it was. Through the static came the fragments. Enemy movement from the ravine. Angles no one had covered. Cal hit in the upper torso, bleeding heavy. The Brimstone had been knocked from its bipod and rolled downslope, half buried in grit. Inside the command tent, Calder's voice cut through the noise. Lock down that position. Get reinforcements up the ridge now. But the quick reaction force was 40 minutes away. The convoy was 13 minutes from Nullwind Ravine. In the desert, those numbers were death sentences. A junior officer shouted over the storm of voices. Gunships? Negative. A sandstorm had grounded them. Rotor blades would be ripped apart in that turbulence. Air cover was gone before it even started. Nora's medical headset was alive with overlapping orders, but she only heard the silence between them. The kind of silence where you realize no plan is coming in time. No one was saying it yet, but the truth was there. The convoy would drive straight into the kill zone, with no overwatch and no way to clear the approach. She pushed into the command tent, map in one hand, the other braced against the frame. Calder turned, frowning. Sir, she began, her voice steady out of sheer force of will. I'm volunteering to take Mercer's position. Every head in the tent swung toward her. Some stared in disbelief. Others smirked, as if they were already picturing how badly this would go. Calder's expression didn't change. Specialist Keane, we are not in a classroom scenario. You are a medic, not a marksman, and certainly not authorized for that rifle. Brimstone is in place. It's sighted. I know the ballistics, she pressed on. The firing window is still open for 200 meters, but not for long. Sir, the convoy is... And you want me to let you take the shot? He interrupted, almost amused. She held his gaze. No, sir, I'm not asking anymore. That froze him for half a beat, long enough for her to see that flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Then his jaw hardened. Absolutely not. That's an order. Nora's lips pressed into a thin line. Understood, sir. And she turned on her heel. She didn't walk back toward the infirmary. She walked toward her quarters. Every step felt like breaking through glass. Not because she feared the consequences, but because the rules she'd lived under for years were splintering beneath her boots. Out in the distance, somewhere on that ridge, Cal was bleeding. Liam was fighting to hold the line alone, and the convoy was still coming. Her mind kept replaying the last message from Obsidian 9. You're the only one who sees it. Act if they won't. The ridge had gone silent, but she wasn't about to let it stay that way. The metal door of her quarters clicked shut behind her. Outside, the wind carried the grit of the desert into every crevice, rattling the thin window panes. Inside, Nora Keane stood perfectly still, listening, not for footsteps or voices, but for the moment her own hesitation might return. It didn't. She crossed to the narrow cot and crouched, fingers hooking under the steel frame. With a sharp pull, she dragged it aside, revealing a recessed panel in the floor. A standard-issue bunk didn't come with a secret compartment, but then Nora wasn't standard issue. The panel lifted with a whisper of grit on metal. Inside lay a velvet-lined case and several carefully wrapped bundles. She unfolded them one by one, a custom optical scope, hand-calibrated to her eye by Eamon himself, laminated wind calculation charts, worn soft at the edges, a pair of pressure-treated gloves, and nestled in the corner, a small, tarnished metal tag. Stamped into the steel were two words, Silent Cross, her brother's call sign. She ran her thumb across the etched letters, remembering the first time she'd seen him wear it, dangling from his vest as he waited out a 19-hour watch, never blinking as the world moved beneath his scope. Back then, she thought it was just a name. Now she knew it was a creed. She packed with the same precision she used in triage. Scope wrapped, charts rolled, gloves pulled on with a practiced snap. Every movement was measured, stripped of anything unnecessary. The medic's bag she slung across her shoulder wasn't just for trauma anymore. It was her insurance policy for whoever was still breathing on that ridge. Through the thin walls, the base was still alive with radio chatter, convoy progress reports, Calder's clipped orders, the kind of background noise that could lull someone into believing the plan was still under control. But Nora knew better. Control was an illusion, and illusions got people killed. Out the back of the barracks, a maintenance yard sat half empty. Fuel drums, tool racks, and a single unmarked desert transport, the kind tech crews used to ferry parts between forward posts. It wasn't armored, it wasn't fast, but it was quiet. She checked the lot. Empty. No eyes on her. Sliding into the driver's seat, she kept her head low as the ignition hummed to life. The yard gate loomed ahead, a rusted chain draped carelessly across it. She eased the truck forward, nudged the chain free, and slipped into the open desert like a shadow breaking from its owner. The drive was a study in contrast. Medics were trained to move toward the wounded, not toward the fight. In the back of her mind, the habit still whispered, stay behind the line, survive so you can help others survive. But the sharper voice, the one Eamon had honed in her, cut through. Sometimes the only way to save them is to stop what's killing them. She realized she was transitioning, not in skill, she'd had that for years, but in mindset. The medic watched the aftermath. The sniper shaped the outcome. They both dealt in life and death, but one reacted while the other anticipated. That shift, she knew, would change everything, if she lived through it. The desert rolled beneath her tires, the horizon swelling with the jagged outline of Falcon Spire. From this distance, the ridge looked like a spine torn from the earth, vertebrae of rock rising against the wind. Somewhere up there, Liam Rourke was clinging to cover, and Cal Mercer was bleeding out. Her fingers flexed on the wheel. She could almost feel the rifle stock against her cheek, the fine tremor of a breath held at the edge of the trigger pull. Years had passed since she'd last fired in the field, but her body remembered. Training like that doesn't fade, it waits. And in the hollow between her heartbeat and the rumble of the engine, she made peace with what was coming. Orders had been given, and she was about to break them, not out of pride, not to prove a point, but because the cost of obedience today would be written in blood. She pressed the accelerator, dust curling in her wake, the ridge growing larger with every second. By the time Nora reached the base of Falcon Spire, the gunfire wasn't distant anymore. It was alive. Each crack and echo ricocheted off the stone like a warning. She killed the engine, slung her medic bag, and began the climb. Loose shale shifted under her boots, but her pace never faltered. At the crest, the scene unfolded in fragments. Liam Rourke crouched behind jagged rock, his rifle idle. Beside him, Sergeant Cal Mercer lay slumped, blood soaking through a makeshift bandage high on his chest. The Brimstone E-50 sat half buried in grit, its matte black barrel glinting faintly in the harsh light. Nora dropped to her knees beside Cal without a word. Her hands moved automatically. Tourniquet high and tight, pressure, dressing layered, morphine auto-injector pressed into his thigh. She leaned close. "Stay with me, Chief," she murmured. "You're not done yet." His eyes fluttered, the ghost of a nod answering her. When she turned toward the Brimstone, Liam's voice cracked. "Doc, what the hell are you?" But the rest died in his throat, because the way she moved wasn't uncertain. It wasn't a medic guessing her way through unfamiliar motions. She dropped prone with fluid economy, fingers slipping beneath the trigger guard as though they belonged there. The stock came to her shoulder like an old friend. Her cheek settled against it, her breathing slowed. Liam had seen plenty of soldiers pick up a weapon. This wasn't that. This was muscle memory. This was muscle memory built over years, not months. Through the scope, Null Wind Ravine came alive. Enemy fighters ghosting between rocks, shifting into firing positions that would cut the convoy to ribbons in under 3 minutes. Nora's world narrowed to reticle and breath. Wind left to right. 7 knots. Drop 18 inches at 1950 meters. Her mind processed it as easily as a medic reads a pulse. 1 breath in. Hold. Find the space between the beats. Squeeze. The Brimstone roared. The sound rolled down the ridge, then was swallowed by the open desert. Below, one fighter collapsed mid-step, dust blooming around him. She shifted before the brass even cooled. Next target, moving left to right, quarter profile. Adjust windage. Exhale. Squeeze. Another drop. Clean. Final. It became a rhythm. Each shot a scalpel, cutting away the threat with surgical precision. She didn't rush, didn't chase. Every movement was deliberate. Acquire, measure, fire, confirm. From beside her, Liam's breathing had changed. It was quicker now, uneven, like he was watching something he couldn't quite believe. By the 5th shot, the ravine's advance stalled. By the 8th, fighters were scrambling for cover they hadn't planned on needing. By the 10th, the kill zone was silent except for the ringing in her ears. Liam finally found his voice. That's not luck. She didn't look at him. Never said it was. You've done this before? She adjusted the scope for a final sweep. Once or twice. But in his eyes she saw it. The realization. This wasn't a medic improvising in desperation. This was someone who had trained for moments exactly like this. Long before the Red Cross patch. Long before anyone told her to stay behind the trigger line. Down below, the convoy moved again, engines rumbling as they pushed through the corridor that, minutes earlier, had been a death trap. From the ridge, it looked almost peaceful, as if nothing had happened at all. But Nora knew better. Every body cooling in the ravine was a second the convoy had been given back. Every shot had been a choice. She eased her finger off the trigger, the weight of the rifle suddenly heavier now that the urgency had drained away. Smoke curled from the barrel, mixing with the desert air. Spent brass lay scattered at her elbow, glinting like quiet testimony. For a moment, she just breathed. Not the controlled breath of a sniper, but the ragged exhale of someone returning to herself after stepping into an old skin she thought she'd shed forever. Liam broke the silence, voice lower this time. Whatever they've been calling you on base, they've been calling you the wrong thing. She allowed herself the smallest smile. Maybe, but inside she knew the truth. In that instant, she hadn't been just a medic. She hadn't been just anything. She had been exactly what the moment demanded, the one thing standing between her team and annihilation. From the ridge, the desert stretched quiet and unbroken. The convoy's engines faded into the distance, their silhouettes shrinking until they disappeared entirely over the far rise. For the first time in nearly an hour, Nora Keane lowered her cheek from the stock of the Brimstone. The ravine below was still. No more movement, no more danger. Just the echo of what had almost been. Beside her, Liam Rourke finally exhaled like a man who'd been holding his breath for miles. Convoy's clear, he said into the comms. Overwatch secure, threat neutralized. There was a pause. Then a voice on the other end, strained with disbelief, asked, Overwatch. Who? Mercer's down. Liam glanced at Nora, then pressed the transmit. Ridge Overwatch is active. Repeat, active. In the command tent back at Fort Ashara, silence followed the report. Commander Reese Calder stood over the sand table, eyes narrowing. The Brimstone wasn't supposed to be in play. The ridge wasn't supposed to be manned. And the only person he'd seen heading toward Falcon Spire after the mortar strike was Nora Keane. 15 minutes later, the thrum of rotor blades rolled across the ridge. A black, Warden-class Chinook cut through the thinning dust storm, its downwash kicking up grit and shell casings around her. Liam shielded his face. Nora just stood, the rifle resting in the crook of her arm, her medic's bag slung across her back. The rear ramp slammed down, and Calder stepped out first. No aids, no weapon in hand. Just his shadow long in the setting light. He stopped 3 paces from her, the wind from the rotors tugging at his uniform. "I gave you an order," he said quietly. Nora met his gaze. "I know." He looked down at the Brimstone, at the dozen spent casings scattered like brass confessions at her feet, then back at her. "You should be facing a court-martial." "Yes, sir," she said evenly. Something unreadable passed through his eyes. "But the truth is, you should have been on that ridge from the start." Before she could answer, another figure emerged from the helicopter. A woman in a long, slate-gray coat. No rank tabs, no unit patch. Her stride was deliberate, her expression sharp but calm. She stopped a meter from Nora and studied her like someone reading an old, half-forgotten file. "You must be Silent Cross's sister," she said. The name landed heavy. Nora's breath caught. Nobody had spoken her brother Eamon's call sign out loud in years. The woman's gaze softened slightly. "He taught me the grass blade crosswind method. Did he ever show you that one?" Nora's voice was low, steady. "He did." That was all the confirmation the woman needed. She turned to Calder. "This isn't an insubordination case. This is a case study in what we almost lost." Then back to Nora. "Effective immediately, Specialist Keane. You're assigned dual role, combat medic and tactical support sniper. You'll train openly this time." The woman stepped back toward the helicopter without another word. Calder gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, then followed. As the Chinook lifted, dust spiraling in its wake, Nora stood alone on the ridge she wasn't supposed to be on, with the rifle she wasn't supposed to touch, after saving people who'd never believed she could. The wind tugged at her hair, carrying with it the faintest echo of her brother's voice. Precision is what remains when chaos takes everything else. The ridge was quiet now. Nora Keane stood alone, boots planted in the same grit that had moments ago shaken under the recoil of the Brimstone. The sun was sinking, dragging long shadows across the rocks, painting the desert in shades of golden blood. The air carried the fading scent of gunpowder, mixed with the dry, mineral tang of the wind. She breathed it in like a reminder of the shot, of the silence that followed, of the lives that kept moving because she hadn't waited for permission. Her hands, still gloved, rested lightly on the rifle. Not clenched, not claiming ownership. Just holding it like one might hold a memory too valuable to put down. Somewhere in that stillness, her brother's voice came back to her. Calm, certain, the way it always had been when he was teaching her to read the wind. Precision is what remains when chaos takes everything else. She closed her eyes, letting the words settle deep. They weren't just about marksmanship. They were about choice. About the discipline to act when the easy option was to stand aside. About cutting through the noise until only what matters is left. The desert had its own kind of honesty. It didn't care about rank or politics or the labels people carried. Out here, you were only what you could do, and whether you did it when the moment came. For years, Nora had worn the medic's patch like a ceiling she couldn't break. To most, she was the quiet one with the bandages, the IV drips, the steady hands for when the damage was already done. They hadn't seen the other side of her. The hours on hidden ranges, the muscle memory her brother had carved into her bones. Now they had. It's easy to underestimate the people who don't demand your attention, the ones who blend into the edges of the frame, who seem content to play a smaller part. But they are not small. They are waiting, watching, building the kind of readiness that doesn't need an announcement. And when the line breaks, when the plan falls apart and the clock runs out, it is often those quiet ones who step into the breach. Not because they were asked, but because they knew no one else could. As the last light bled from the sky, Nora slung the Brimstone over her shoulder and began the walk back down the ridge. Each step left a print in the sand, already half filled by the wind. Somewhere, in another place or another time, there would be another ridge. Another moment when protocol and survival stood at odds. And when it came, she knew she would act. Because she had learned something in the heart of the chaos. The overlooked aren't incapable. They're simply unseen, until everything depends on them. In the end, Nora's story isn't just about the military, a rifle, or a ridge. It's about what happens when someone steps forward after being underestimated for years. In our modern lives, how many Noras do we pass by every day? The quiet coworker whose ideas never get heard, the neighbor who's lived through more than anyone realizes, the family member who steps up in a crisis when no one expects it. In a world that often rewards volume over value, Nora's story reminds us that skill, courage, and integrity don't always announce themselves, but they are there, waiting for the moment that matters. And maybe that's the lesson. Never judge someone only by the role you see. You might be standing next to the person who could save everything. What do you think? Have you ever seen someone rise to the moment like Nora did? Or maybe you've been that person. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might inspire someone else. Thank you for listening to this journey. If it resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and join us for more stories that remind us of the quiet heroes among us.